Loading. Welcome to Access the Animus.
Hello everyone and welcome to a new video here on Access the Animus. The embargo is lifted and today we can finally share with you some in-game footage about the upcoming Dawn of Ragnarok DLC for Assassin's Creed Valhalla, along with a ton of news about many of its gameplay aspects and features. In the video we're going to discuss and show some of the new powers that Odin is going to wield in the DLC, along with a detailed explanation about their features, before moving on to analyze all the news that we got about the new enemy types, the new skills, the new electrical abilities, and the new Atgeir weapon type. We're also going to have a look at the environments that can be found in Svartalfheim, with a focus on the Dwarven Shelters and some more info about the Valkyrie Arena. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking it, subscribing to our channel and turning the notifications on so you won't miss any of our future updates. And with that out of the way, let's dive into our first look at the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC for Assassin's Creed Valhalla. So, in the last few weeks we were kindly invited to attend a presentation about the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC for Valhalla, hosted by producer Mariana Gosteva, creative director Mikhail Lozanov, and game director Georgi Popov, who took us through several pieces of information about the upcoming DLC and even showed us a demo, so we couldn't play it directly, of a chunk of a sequence that was very useful to understand some of the mechanics of the expansion. And we were also provided with some gameplay footage, which we're happy to show you today and in the coming days as well, with the classic and standard caveat that what we're showing you is still a work in progress and according to Ubisoft doesn't represent the final quality of the DLC, which is going to release in 1 month on March the 10th. So this video will be mainly focused on some of the gameplay news related to the DLC, while an upcoming one will be more focused on the new story aspects that we witnessed, which we're also going to merge with the other story news that we had promised a week ago and still haven't delivered because we have been kinda busy lately. According to what we were told, Dawn of Ragnarok will act as an endgame content with a suggested power level of 340, but both players that have played the game but haven't reached that level and completely new players will have the opportunity to play the expansion right away through some dedicated boosted stats and gear. At this point we should all know the basics of the story here, with the invasion of Svartalfheim by the Muspel forces led by Surtur and the remaining dwarves having to take refuge from the war, and if you don't recall the context, you can check our story video dedicated to it. In the demo, we got to see a small chunk of a quest which saw Odin traveling to one of the oldest areas of Svartalfheim, now controlled by Glod, a bastard son of Surtur, half Muspel and half Jotun. Odin was traveling to that area in search of one of the dwarves' shelters, and when he reached it, he caught wind of a relic, almost surely a piece of Eden, which he planned to use against his new opponent Surtur. Now, even before reaching the shelter, the devs showed us a bit of the world that can be found in the DLC. We'll try and spare you from the PRE words here, but the world is kind of a mashup of several different environments and biomes, with some green hills, a lot of lava for sure, several elements of what was called Dwarven architecture and cities, like the city of Oldar that can be seen in the demo, whose buildings, according to the devs, are going to be pretty tall, allowing players to stay as much as possible on the roofs without touching the ground. The world will also feature several golden karst hills, the one that can be seen in many of the Dawn of Ragnarok assets and then we can now see in-game as well, a number of foundries and forges now controlled by the Muspels and used both as prisons and also as locations for imposed labor on the dwarves, and even the so-called monoliths of Muspelheim, which, if we got it correctly, should be the flying pieces of land covered in lava that we can see while wandering the world, and that we wager can be accessed by flying towards them via the power of the Raven, which we'll see later. All of this will be covered by the burnt roots of the Yggdrasil, and I'd imagine those are not burnt by chance, you know, but we might talk about that in one of our future videos. In the footage, Odin can be seen wandering around the world with this boar, which might not be a random one. It might actually be Gullinbursti or Slidrugtani, the boar who was forged in the Norse mythology by the dwarves Brock and Eitri or Sindri, the same dwarves that created Mjolnir and Draupnir, a golden ring possessed by the god Odin with magical powers that might be here represented by the Hugr-Rip bracer, which we're going to talk about later. This mythological boar, Gullinbursti, was also said to be able to run through air and water, and I don't think that that's going to happen in the game, but with all this magic stuff, I guess anything could happen. So in the demo, our quest required Odin to reach one of the Dwarven Shelters, and apparently these won't be precisely indicated on the map, as players will have to find them on their own through several hints that the DLC will provide them with. For starters, their area should be marked on the map with a dedicated icon, and in-game these areas are usually surmounted by flocks of birds flying over them. Upon reaching the shelter area, players will be able to detect the exact location by finding some drawings/symbols called Dwarven markings, which might be placed upon boxes, rocks, carts, etc. to show them the way. Shelters are usually located deep underground. The one shown in the demo, for example, called Granhellir, is located in a cave deep below the ground with huge crystals placed around it, but every shelter will apparently be unique and have a unique location/theme to it, like for example some brutalist Dwarven architecture, quoting creative director Mikhail Lozanov. Shelters will be important for the player's progression as well, as they will have a number of shops and vendors, presumably the same types from the main game, and this makes me wonder if those are going to be the only vendors around, as the world is actually invaded by the enemy forces. The blacksmith in particular, along with telling you their story, will allow you to buy items, but also to upgrade the Hugr-Rip, which is the bracer that we saw in one of the early screenshots that allows Odin to wield his powers in the DLC. As we mentioned already in our past videos, in this DLC Odin will be able to use a number of magical powers, 5 in total to be precise, that can be acquired from selected defeated enemies and even other sources, but he will be available to hold a maximum of 2 at any time. This scarcity of powers, according to the devs, should lead players towards strategizing about them, like on how to approach a situation, through which powers, and so on. Getting a power from an enemy will trigger an on-screen toggle prompting players to choose which of the powers at their disposal they want to drop in exchange for the one they are taking, and this should be one of the strategic decisions as to how to approach the various missions that the players will have in front of them. So there's going to be 5 available powers in the game, 2 of which concern imbuing weapons with eyes and teleporting through bows and arrows, which weren't actually shown in the demo, while the other 3 ones were discussed and shown extensively. The first one is the so-called Power of Muspelheim, which will cause Odin to not receive any kind of damage from fire and lava, and will also allow him to walk over it. At the same time, this makes Odin look like a Muspel, and thus the Muspel enemies will perceive him as one of them until provoked. That is considered by the devs as granting social stealth skills, as it will allow Odin to wander around the Muspel guards, hear them talk for some context dialogues, and get out of potentially difficult situations. In the demo, we even saw that the power can seemingly be used to instantly reset to incognito while still being in front of the enemies that were fighting Odin a second prior, which kinda looks like cheating? I don't know, maybe that's just my opinion, and after all, it's just another option provided to the players. The second power that we were able to witness is called Power of the Raven, and it allows Odin to turn into a raven, fly over the world, reach new areas and land manually or through an auto-land feature, and all of that until the player runs out of the energy needed to support the powers, which we're going to talk about later. This ability will seemingly be very useful to reach palaces and areas located at the top of mountains or hills in a matter of seconds, but it will also come in handy while trying to scout the nearby enemies and the powers that they have, so that the player can create a strategy based on them. And of course, an upgrade of this power can allow Odin to air assassinate his enemies, as we saw in the trailer. The third power that was shown was the Power of Rebirth, which should be fairly known at this point. When it's active, killed enemies will be raised from the dead and fight on Odin's side, making this power apparently effective against the Jotun enemies. An interesting use for this power, according to the devs, is to match it with an air assassination, as it causes a silent kill plus an immediate ally, but the most interesting approach to it that we could see is that the power can be used retroactively, as in, you kill a bunch of enemies without consuming energy or anything, then you activate the power and all the dead enemies are brought back to life at the same time, kinda like a ready to use army, which is pretty cool to look at. The powers can be activated by using the right shoulder button like RT or R2 depending on your platform, and using a power or having it activated will consume a resource called Hugr, which pretty much means life essence, and there's going to be a gauge signaling how this resource is being consumed along with a number of, let's call them energy bars, that signal how many times this gauge can be refilled and then consumed again. When the gauge is almost at its end, there will be also some light green pulses at the side of the screen to let the players know that they do indeed need to refill. Odin can obtain the Hugr from every living being in Svartalfheim, like for example killing enemies, but also huge and disproportionate animals like this raven, but he can also gain it from big flowers called Hugr blooms, and even from the so-called shrines of Yggdrasil, which are locations where the Yggdrasil tree sprouted its roots and the dwarves built monuments around it. At these shrines, Odin will be able to exchange part of his life for some more energy, and from the footage it looks like Odin can bargain 2/3 of his life bar in exchange for 1 full bar of energy for his powers. So based on all these requirements, all this energy consumption and the necessity to farm it, managing the power duration, the energy gauge and the energy bars properly will allow players to make the powers last much more, which should be useful in the worst situations. As we mentioned earlier, Odin will be able to use the powers thanks to an artifact called Hugr-Rip, which he's going to receive from the dwarves. The Hugr-Rip and thus its powers can be upgraded at the blacksmiths, which are usually found within the Dwarven Shelters, and each of the 5 powers will have 2 upgrades. One of which always seems to be about the duration of the power, while the second one is more focused on adding a feature to that power, like the flying assassination tied to the power of the raven. And along with this, there's also going to be a separate upgrade that adds a second Hugr bar, meaning that Odin will be able to accumulate more energy to use these powers. There also seem to be 6 types of resources in the inventory which will be required to activate the Hugr-Rip upgrades, triggering the usual and honestly at this point boring RPG progression system where you gather resources so you can do an action that will allow you to gather other resources and so on. The DLC will also come with new skills and abilities unrelated to the powers, and while we did not see any of the skills, we had a look at a bunch of the abilities, and most of them are centered around the use of electricity and electric powers. So, while not knowing the names of the abilities, we have an electric arrow that seemingly causes an instant stun status that allows Odin to one-shot kill the enemy hit by the arrow, maybe? Or maybe the Atgeir in this build is pretty strong, and this same ability, unless it's another one, if it hits from up close, it will not only knock back the enemies, but, and I hope the day where I had to say this would never come, but here we are, they also undergo some electrical elemental damage or effect in this Assassin's Creed DLC. And wow, I kinda feel dirty for even saying that, but okay. Another ability which we saw in the demo only seems to be like a backwards jump that Odin does, and in his place on the ground some kind of thunder appears, electrifying and paralyzing all the enemies around. We also have an ability where Odin hits the enemy multiple times with his axe, and while performing this ability the player seems to be prompted to hit the heavy attack button for Odin to imbue his weapons of some kind of electrical element in order to finish his opponent. And finally, there's also an ability where Odin uses a kind of warrior bow, throwing multiple electrical arrows at nearby enemies. Of course, there's going to be some new weapons and armor in Dawn of Ragnarok, and while we didn't get any details about them, save from one notable exception, we can see a lot of them in the assets, in the footage we were provided with, and of course in the trailer. What we were told though is that in the DLC players will be able to upgrade all their gear and weapons to a new level or quality called Divine Quality. This new customization level will of course allow for stats upgrades, but it will also bring an upgraded perk rune slot, where players will be able to place the so-called Odin runes, and these Odin runes will offer some additional customization options for the powers, but will also enhance Odin in some other ways that weren't explained further. So as it is the standard for this type of games, these Odin runes will be scattered across Svartalfheim, and players will have to find them if they want to get those extra customization options. Going back to the weapons, the notable exception that I mentioned earlier is the Atgeir, the new weapon type introduced with the DLC that we finally saw in action. The Atgeir, like we said in the past, is a type of pole arm that was used in the Viking Age, and as such, its size and weight will come into play during combat. It's a heavy weapon and it has a unique combo system, and while it doesn't look as slow as the bigger axes, it does seem like it's more oriented towards less speed and more damage. Like I said, it will have a unique combo system which, according to the devs, might reward what they called precise players. This combo system will allow players to mix light and heavy attacks that will cause interesting finishers, but that's also the case for the other weapons in the game. But parrying and counter-attacking with this weapon will allow Odin to release a wide area blow that might hit more than one surrounding enemy. In some specific kills, the weapon will also be able to produce a knockback effect, sending enemies flying backwards, and apparently it will also be able to cause a quote-unquote overhead slam that will eventually defeat Odin's opponents. The DLC will also contain a Valkyrie Arena, which we sadly didn't see in action, but it is considered as its own new game mode. The arena, as we already mentioned in the past, will be hosted by a Valkyrie, and in there players will find new and familiar faces as well, coming from Dawn of Ragnarok and apparently from Valhalla's main game, which makes it even more likely that we might be seeing Hugr and or some of the bosses faced during the Asgard and Jotunheim arcs in there. In the arena, players will be able to choose different boasts that will increase the difficulty of the fights, potentially even changing the type of challenge and the playstyle needed to carry it out. Players will also be able to seemingly combine different boasts for the same challenge, with the obvious assumption that the more boasts are used, the better the rewards. The DLC will also add several new enemies and enemy types. Before jumping to the, I can't even say human enemies, but you get what I mean, we can mention that there's going to be some local animals that might attack on sight, though we don't know which animals they would be, but we also have seen some disproportionate ravens that won't only provide Odin with the Hugr Energy, but will also give him the power of the raven. Big locations such as the city of Uldar that was shown in the demo will allow players to find different types of enemies that in turn will allow them to gain access to the various powers. In this case, having the power of the Raven might allow players to have a better view about where the enemy they're looking for, and thus the power they're looking for, are located. While we didn't see any Jotun enemy, and we can assume that a number of those will be reused from the main game's mythological arcs, we did see a number of new Muspel enemy types, and we were even told that when there's a high number of enemies nearby, during the fight sequences, one of them can emit a war cry or a battle cry that is going to make the enemies more dangerous, and they will also apparently glow to signal that. The first type of these new Muspel enemies, well, they are the standard soldiers simply called Muspels, which will have a standard moveset but sometimes might be wielding a flaming sword. Then we have seen the mention of a Hellraiser, but we couldn't see him in action, and we also have the Ashbringer, who seems like a brute and warrior enemy dealing heavy attacks, and whose most particular attack features a hammer that when it hits the ground it causes some lava explosions. We also have seen some unnamed enemies that throw fire bombs from the distance, and also have them drop from the sky, similar to some of the enemies from the main game, but the main attraction here were the Flame Keepers, who are some elite enemies that bring back fallen enemies and can even create new enemies out of pools of lava. These enemies are called Surtur's Fury, and they will launch themselves at Odin and sacrifice themselves to explode in front of him in order to inflict some more damage. And lastly, as a side mention, in this DLC the loading screens will seemingly be made up of quotes by Odin. The one we saw was about Odin discussing his relationship with the dwarves to a young Baldur, and so yeah, unless this was just part of our presentation, we may probably not have access to the memory corridor room where we can roam around with our Odin, but in turn we may have a few additional bits of lore here and there, which is not too bad. And that was it for our new look at the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC and our report on all the different gameplay news based on the recent presentation that we attended and the new footage that we just showed you. And once again, our question is, are you interested in this kind of DLC? Now that you heard about these news, which are the features that you are the most and the least interested in? Let us know in the comments below. Also, keep an eye out on our channel soon. We have way more content lined up and planned for the next days and weeks. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in our next video.